There are many styles of worship, and there are many wonderful styles and patterns of worship that are different in the breadth and depth and length of the history of the Christian church. I think there's a wonderful place at the table for the Anglican church and liturgical worship in the traditions of the Anglican church in the spirit of the English Reformation. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why. First of all, liturgy helps tell a story. The church calendar isn't something that you see prescribed for worship in the scriptures. And yet, you do see in the Old Testament patterns of worship that revolved around the calendar. When the Lord sent Moses to bring Israel out of Egypt, and he told them to hold this Passover feast annually as a remembrance of what God had done among his people, he told them that the month of their deliverance would be the first of months for them. He patterned their year beginning with a record of redemption. That's fascinating. And I think you can see liturgical worship highlighted even in other texts in the Bible. In Acts chapter 3, you see the apostles, and this is after Jesus had died and risen and appeared. This is after Pentecost, and they're going to the temple during the hours of prayer. And I think when I grew up in kind of an evangelical, basic Christian, non-denom environment, I just had this impression that the disciples loved Jesus, followed Jesus, and I didn't know any kind of pattern to their life and worship. But here you have some of the early apostles going to the temple during the hours of prayer. You mean they kept hours of prayer? The temple? Oh, of course. Well, there's a temple there. Well, why are they still going to it? I mean, they're Christians now. No, they saw Christ fulfill all that was in the Old Testament, and they were used to these patterns of worship. You see Paul the apostle, who's an evangelist to the Gentiles, going on these remarkable missionary journeys, and he still wants to be in Jerusalem for the Passover. Does that mean he wasn't a Christian anymore? No, it mean he was. And he understood all these feasts, liturgies, and festivals in light of the gospel being fulfilled in the gospel. They didn't lose their meaning, they gained meaning. And so the early church had patterns for liturgical worship, and they had to do with how they patterned their year. The observance of Easter and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and a period of 40 days or longer of fasting and preparation for that time. I mean, it's all over Scripture, these patterns of liturgical worship, and that was remarkable to me. And seasons tend to tell the story. And so liturgy tells a story, the church calendar can tell a story, and even within the span of one service, the Book of Common Prayer helps us retell the story. And that's one of the charges to the church in a day like this. Keep telling the story of God as Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. I think the other reason that there's an argument for Anglican Christian worship is that spiritual formation matters. I'm fascinated with trees at this portion in my life. I was staring up at a large tree for a long time, and one of the neighbors came up and said, "What are you looking at? Is there a hawk up?" I said, "No." "What are you looking at?" I'm looking at the tree. And it's like, the tree's not enough. There had to be something in the tree. No, I'm actually looking at the tree. I'm studying trees. I'm learning about trees. I'm fascinated by trees. And one of the things I've learned is that, you don't always get to correct the trunk. The way a tree grows, it takes time, and you don't get to mend it a whole lot after a certain period of time. They're going to lean out to the light, and if you have a tree leaning out towards the road, well, it's going to keep growing that way. It's going to keep leaning that way. And, I found a lot of my life, I didn't grow up on the straight and narrow. I should have. I was taught better. I just didn't heed any of it. And I found that course corrections are tough for trees, and they're tough for humans also. And so spiritual formation matters tremendously. And I think that the liturgy of the church is wonderful and a great aid to healthy spiritual formation. If you have a tall oak tree, you want a nice straight trunk and a central leader right up into the canopy from which all the branches reach out. I think for Christians, spiritual formation that's rooted in the liturgy of the church historic aids us in that strong central leader and a strong structure for a healthy spiritual life. Why? Well, I taught for a number of years in a Christian school, and it was remarkable to me that even in that environment, young people had no idea what the Lord's Prayer is. They couldn't recite it. No one in their church would recite it. We've lost a place for the confession of sin, and that's replete through the Scriptures. These are all healthy things that lead to healthy spiritual formation. We use Scripture and liturgy that we're not reading otherwise, because we're usually people on the move. Maybe we would listen to a podcast or something, but rarely do we sit down and actually read the Scriptures. One of the things that's lost on people that I think is very helpful is that we've rediscovered the public reading of Scripture as an element of Christian worship. It's not just that I'm going to read a sermon text and preach on it. No, we're going to read from the Old Testament, we're going to recite the Psalms together, we're going to read from the New Testament, we're going to read a gospel lesson. And they all speak of the same thing. But it's a different mentality to walk into the church and learn to listen again to the Bible read. We don't read to each other aloud anymore. The Bible originally was written to be read aloud to people. We've rediscovered the beauty of reading Scripture aloud. This service of Anglican and a lot of liturgical churches, it's rooted in Scripture, and upholding even the public reading of Scripture is a wonderful element of Christian worship. And so these things help to the right spiritual formation of a human being. One of my children is mentally handicapped. I have a son who's autistic. He can make out some words, but he can't read per se. And he's been reared in this Anglican church. He can sing the doxology. He can sing the Sanctus. He can recite the Lord's Prayer. He hears these things. He sings these truths. I think there's something very important, something that we probably don't treasure as we ought to in spiritual formation when it comes to liturgical worship. And then I would also submit that there's a place for Anglican worship as to relevancy in this culture and life, because it's historical, it's rooted in something. The Anglican Church has over 80 million people worldwide that use this very basic form of Christian liturgy in their daily and corporate worship. It's a lot of people. It's the third largest body of Christianity throughout the world. And I guess that's the other point, is that it's throughout the world. This is a global expression of Christianity. Remarkable thing when you see bishops over provinces gather from Asia, from Africa, from the Americas, and they're confessing that one faith. I remember when I was younger, when I was first working at a church, I walked into the chapel, and this was an influential church. It was a large church. And there was a meeting of bishops throughout many parts of the world in our little chapel that held 150 people. And normally we would walk in as a staff for morning prayer, and there'd be probably 10 people. And that day, it was my day to lead morning prayer. It was probably 8 o'clock in the morning. And I walk into the chapel, and all these bishops are vested. There's probably 80 bishops. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And yeah, I was definitely relieved of duty that day. I wasn't leading morning prayer. They were going to have a morning Eucharist. But I've never forgotten that they sang together, the church is one foundation. And the voices in that chapel of all those bishops, all these men singing the church is one foundation from all different parts of the world, that was glorious. It was a picture to me that, you know what, having been raised going to all these, fun camps and neat retreats, and okay, there's something here. They're singing deeply to a God they love of deep truths, reverently but loudly, majestically, manly. There's a place for liturgical worship. And I think the Anglican Church, insofar as it holds to the Scriptures, insofar as the 39 articles infuse the Book of Common Prayer and help us understand its application and proclamation, I think there's tremendous room for Anglican worship in this day and this culture. It does tell the story of the history of redemption. It does matter how we're spiritually formed, and it does help and broaden our understanding when we're rooted in history and we have a global expression to our faith. If that's something that resonates with you, I invite you to investigate it and participate in it. Thank you for watching.